Welcome back to the channel. Today we will be comparing this BMW M2 Competition from the previous generation against the Porsche 718 Cayman GTS 4.0. Now I've done a similar comparison video, including the base M2 pitted against the 718 GTS with the 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, but this comparison will be looking at the refreshed versions of both of those cars. An M2 Competition like this one can be bought nowadays for around $55,000 to $60,000 here in the US, whereas a Cayman GTS 4.0 still goes for around $95,000 to $100,000, and that's used. So is the extra 40 to 45 grand worth it? That's what we're going to find out. Now, a few specs about this M2 Competition compared to the base M2. Although this is the same chassis, it has a number of upgrades that makes it a lot more desirable in most people's eyes. First and foremost, it has the S55 BMW engine carried over from the F80 M3. Now, similar to the N55 from the regular M2, this is also a 3-liter turbocharged straight 6, but this has twin turbos. The N55 only has a single twin scroll turbo. So this makes 405 horsepower and 406 pound-feet. It's a little bit detuned from the F80 M3, but it's still 40 horsepower more than the base M2 has. Compared to the base M2, this also has upgraded brakes, suspension, steering, you name it. They've tweaked pretty much everything. So although this car looks mostly the same from the outside, it does have quite a few performance upgrades that should make it more enjoyable and capable. We have a 6-speed manual transmission. You can also get this with a 7-speed dual clutch. This car comes standard with a rear limited slip differential. It has electric power steering, and the owner Evan has done a few mods to this to make it more enjoyable on a daily basis as well as on a racetrack. He does track this quite a bit. He said he's done 20 track days in this car already. And he's taken a very similar approach to modifying this car that I take with my cars. Basic bolt-ons that don't sacrifice too much of that daily drivability. So for suspension, we have KWV3 coilovers with ground control camber plates. We have an AP Racing front big brake kit. We have these gorgeous, almost Subi spec gold Volk TE37 wheels. They're 18 by 10 plus 41, and they're wrapped in Michelin Pilot Sport All-Season 4 tires, which is his daily driver tire setup. He also has an Akrapovic exhaust. Now, this car, despite its compact dimensions, I wouldn't classify as lightweight. It tips the scales at somewhere around 3,500 to 3,600 pounds, which is quite a bit heavier than that Cayman GTS, probably 400 to 500 pounds or so. But anyways, let's see how this handles on this bumpy canyon road and see how it compares to the GTS 4.0. Love that it still has a manual handbrake. Push to start. Now for drive modes, we are going to turn traction and stability control fully off. We're going to set it into Evan's custom M1 mode, which is essentially Sport for the throttle response and then Sport Plus for the steering. First things first, this engine makes a very boomy sound at low RPM. It doesn't sound quite as pleasant as the base M2's N55 in my opinion, but it does have a much higher redline at 7,600 RPM. That's quite high for a turbocharged engine. We're on some Ferodo DS2500 brake pads, same as what I have on my NSX, and they have a very progressive linear feel, pretty much like stock. There's the rasp from the S55 at high RPM. This thing's lively with all the systems turned off. This thing is definitely a bit of a handful to drive. Wow, this engine pulls so hard at the top end. It's such a big difference from the base M2. It has a much more motorsporty feel to it. Man, when those twin turbos hit boost, this thing just rockets you forward. It feels like a much more boosted engine than the N55. You actually have to wait for the turbos to spool up, whereas the N55 gives you a lot more of a linear power delivery. Personally, I prefer this. It rewards you for winding it out to redline. Steering in Sport Plus mode, has good weight. I actually wouldn't want it any lighter than this for aggressive driving. Steering feel is not bad for an EPS, but also it's not brimming with feedback like a hydraulic rack. All right, let's do a straight line pull here. Hey, this engine doesn't sound bad at high RPM. It's really in the lower to mid-range of the rev range where it sounds a little bit drony, a little bit boomy. I'm not sure if that's due to this Akrapovic exhaust, but when you wind it out, this engine really does reward you. Very easy to heel toe, good throttle response as long as you keep the revs high. Brakes feel amazing, as does every AP racing kit I've tried. Woo! Got some farts from the S55, one of its defining features. Lots of grip from these all-season Michelin tires. It feels kind of like a PS4S on this road. This car is actually really well dialed. Oh yes. It's a lively car, that's for sure. The turbo lag actually makes it a little bit of a challenge to control the car coming out of corners, especially second gear hairpins. You have to be ready for when that surge in torque comes on, because it'll spin up the rear tires no problem and send this thing sideways. I was caught slightly off guard back there, to be totally honest. I didn't think the turbo lag would be that noticeable, I guess. Really well sorted car though. KWV3 suspension is a gold standard for a mild street setup, and this car is a perfect example why it works so well with the M2 Competition. Excellent damping, you get plenty of body control in the corners while also being able to handle bumps pretty much at full throttle. So good, so good. This is such a better car than the base M2, if I'm being totally honest. Other than the engine sound, maybe, I mean, you either like it or you don't, but personally, I like how this engine sounds at high RPM. But outside of the engine sound, this car is better in every way. Steering feels more direct. Now, obviously, I can't comment on the brakes and suspension of a stock M2 comp, but what Evan has done here makes it feel like OEM, or at least OEM plus. The straight line performance of this car is at such a higher level than the base M2. I remember driving the base M2 on this road not too long ago, and it was not as accelerative, not even close. That extra 40 horsepower, I think it's actually more than that. At least the butt dyno makes me think that. All right, one more straight line pull, and then we will hop into the Cayman GTS 4.0. We're just gonna roll into it so I don't roast these tires. Oh yeah, there it is. This car is so fast, but it still feels composed. That's the thing. You would think of an M2 being kind of a oversteer monster even on a canyon road, and yes, it will do that if you really prod it, if you really poke it, but if you drive it neat and tidy, the car will respond to your inputs very well, as long as you are aware of the turbo lag. That's really the only thing about this car, in my opinion, that feels spiky. The rest of the car feels very natural to drive. If you're used to driving front-engine rear-wheel drive sports cars, especially BMWs, then this will feel right at home. And the simple mods that Evan has done has really enhanced the feel and performance of this car without sacrificing its daily drivability. So with that being said, let's hop into the 718 Cayman GTS 4.0 and see if it's worth the extra 40 to 50 grand. Okay, so we're now in the 718 Cayman GTS 4.0 with a PDK dual clutch transmission. I've already driven one of these cars with a manual transmission. Actually, there's 2 videos on my channel on that car. So if you want to see specifically how the manual GTS 4.0 feels, check out those videos. All right, so a few specs about the Cayman GTS 4.0. This is a very well-balanced sports car, even on paper. Of course, it has the 4-liter flat-6 naturally aspirated engine carried over from the 718 GT4, but it's been detuned just a bit to 394 horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque. With the PDK and with these amazingly adjustable 18-way power seats, first time ever trying these seats, by the way, these things do add some weight to the car, so I believe in this spec, this car should be close to 3,200 pounds, maybe in the 3,100 plus pound range. But even then, this is at least 450 to 500 pounds lighter than the M2 Competition. And of course, it's a much lower car as well. The center of gravity should be significantly lower. I mean, I'm sitting way lower, way closer to the ground. It's a much more driver-focused interior. Build quality, I would say, is noticeably better as well, as it should be, given the difference in MSRP between these two cars. Nick, the owner of this GTS 4.0, mentioned that this carbon steering wheel was actually a zero-cost option. Now, as much as I love the Race Tex material from Porsche, this carbon looks way cooler, doesn't it? Nick also mentioned that the only mod he's put on this GTS 4.0 is the sole over-axle pipes. And the way it's set up right now is we can use the HomeLink buttons to either close the valves or open them. So obviously we're going to drive with those valves open. There we go. We are going to put this into Sport Plus. This car has PASM adaptive dampers as standard, as well as Porsche torque vectoring with the rear limited slip differential. We're going to turn PSM fully off. Let's see how this car drives and how it compares to that M2 Competition, which I have to say has set the bar really high. Is this car worth $40,000 to $50,000 more in the used market today? That's the question. Also, we're going to use this PDK shifter in manual mode. I prefer it to the paddles. There's that crazy induction note that I remember from driving the manual version of this car. RPM redline from this naturally aspirated flat 6. It just sounds glorious. One of the best sounding cars you can buy, period, short of a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. Of course, we have electric power steering. It's very precise, very direct. It is better than the steering rack in the M2 Competition, but not by as wide of a margin as I originally thought. The M2 Comp steering rack actually is not bad at all. This just feels a little bit more precise with a little bit less slop. Never get tired of a flat 6 Porsche, especially a Cayman. That mid-engine handling balance is just so sublime. It's so neutral on turn-in as well as corner exit. Straight line pull, first gear. What a sound. This sounds miles better than the S55 in that M2 Comp. It is not even close. So much confidence at high speed, despite not having any real downforce. Pirelli P0 tires, and they're not the grippiest, so this car actually is quite playful on this road. Long gearing, we're in third, and we're just outside the power band in that sweeper. The PASM dampers in the stiffer setting, this car is a bit firm, but at least it does give you really good body control. It's not quite as comfortable as the KW V3s in Evan's M2 Comp, I would say, but still very good. You know what? It's actually a little bit too firm. I'm gonna back the dampers off. And that's the beauty of PASM. In the softer setting, this car's perfectly fine. It has great compliance over the bumps, while still giving you plenty of body control. It's not like this car becomes a soggy noodle in the corners. Wow. GTS 4.0 with a PDK, pretty damn good car from the factory with just a little bit of extra sound from these sole over axle pipes. Do I prefer the manual version of this car? Yes, but that applies in any car that has a manual option. At least this PDK is the absolute best dual clutch transmission right now, in my opinion. Based on the ones I've driven, I haven't driven any Ferrari DCTs, but this PDK is pretty faultless. Just dive so deep into corners, have so much confidence mid-corner. You can attack corners harder than you can in the M2, for sure. This car just inspires more confidence. And that's mainly due to the mid-engine layout. This car is just more balanced into and out of a corner. There's no two ways about it. But does that make it the more enjoyable car to drive? That's the question that I'm actually not so sure about now. Despite the M2 Competition being objectively worse in every way, other than it having more power and obviously quite a bit more torque, in a straight line, I'm pretty sure this would beat the M2 Competition because it is so much lighter and has a similar amount of peak power. On a racetrack, this should be easily the faster car. But am I enjoying it more right now? I feel like I was giggling harder when I was driving the M2 Comp. And I think it comes down to the fact that that car doesn't take itself quite as seriously. They're both serious performers, don't get me wrong, but the M2 Competition, it's more willing to play with you. It's more animated. It's not as composed, it's not as sharp, but is that really everything you want in a sports car? Let me shut up for a second, do one more straight line pull, and we'll summarize the comparison. Oh man, the sound of this engine is far superior to the one in the M2 Comp, but outside of that, I think the M2 Comp puts a bigger smile on my face. It's a riot to drive in every sense of the term. If this was a comparison between a base M2 and a 718 Cayman GTS, or any 718 Cayman from the S model and above, pretty much, it would be a no-brainer. The Cayman is just that much better, and the base M2, in my opinion, is a little bit lacking in some ways. The engine doesn't feel special enough. The chassis is good, but not brilliant. The M2 Comp really just takes everything up a notch or two and makes it significantly more enjoyable. It really is a much better car than the base M2, especially with the mods that Evan has done, which are very simple reversible mods, by the way. Nothing about it is extreme. It's just literally coilovers, front brake kit, and an exhaust pretty much, and some wheels and tires. And with just those few mods, you get, in my opinion, a more fun car to drive compared to a stock GTS 4.0 for a lot less money. Those mods combined, you're probably talking less than $10,000. So you do the math, 55K plus 10K, around 65, at most $70,000 all in, compared to a $95,000 to $100,000 used Cayman GTS 4.0. The M2 Comp, I think, is a screaming value if you look at it from that standpoint. But I totally understand the appeal of the Cayman. I'm actually not taking away anything from it. It's a much more precise, razor-edged, finessed sports car driving experience. And if that's what you want, by all means, it's not even a question. You already know what car to get. But for me, despite the merits that both of these cars have, the M2 Comp is the one that wins this comparison video, just because it's just such a riot to drive. And the mods that Evan has done have just elevated it even more. Let me know what you think of these two cars. Would you pick an M2 Competition, or would you pay the extra money for the 718 GTS 4.0? Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.